She, a white woman, never expected her life to take such an unexpected turn. Now the mother of 3 black newborn boys, she's facing challenges most of us can't even imagine. But amid it all, there's a shocking truth about to change everything. What would you do if you were in her shoes? This story will captivate you from start to finish. Let me know in the comments from where in the world you're watching or listening to this story. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and share so others can discover this journey of strength and resilience. Richard and Pamela met in their teenage years, and from the very first moment, their paths seemed destined to intertwine. Pamela was studying law, and Richard was studying engineering. During their college years, their relationship solidified, and they seemed inseparable. However, everything changed when Pamela discovered that Richard was cheating on her with a classmate. Pamela walked through the city streets with her head down, the noise of traffic and distant conversations blending into a constant hum. She felt the weight of betrayal still fresh on her chest, like an open wound that wouldn't heal. It was a cold autumn afternoon, and the wind blew fiercely, but she barely felt it. Her mind was trapped in tormenting memories. Richard's laughter, his whispered promises under the stars, the sensation of his skin when he embraced her. But now, those moments were tainted by the image of him with another girl, a classmate who had been nothing more than an insignificant shadow until that day. It had been an accident, or at least that's what Richard had said when he tried to explain himself. "Pamela, it means nothing," he had said with tears welling in his eyes, desperate to make her understand. But she couldn't hear anything beyond the roar of her own pain. How could it mean nothing when it meant everything to her? Breaking up with Richard was the hardest decision she had ever had to make, but she knew it was necessary in order to move forward. Now, months later, she found herself in a new phase of her life, a phase that had unexpectedly begun with Harry, her classmate. Harry had been her friend for years, always in the shadows, always available when she needed him. She had never thought of him that way before, but in the midst of her sadness, his kindness and constant presence began to mean something more. At first, it was just a comfort, a balm for her open wound. But slowly, what started as a relationship based on need transformed into something deeper. "Are you okay?" Harry asked softly, pulling her out of her thoughts. They were sitting in a small cafe that Pamela frequented when she needed a break. The aroma of freshly ground coffee filled the air, and the sound of cups gently clinking against each other provided a strange sense of tranquility. Pamela nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, I was just thinking about—" She paused, not wanting to mention Richard. She didn't want to hurt Harry, who looked at her with those eyes full of hope and devotion. Harry tilted his head, watching her with a mix of understanding and sadness. He knew who she was referring to without her having to say it. He had learned to read the emotions on her face, especially when it came to Richard. He couldn't blame her. He knew how much she had loved that man, but he also knew how much he himself loved her. He cleared his throat and tried to change the subject. "Do you remember the time we tried to make sushi at home?" he asked with a smile. Pamela let out a soft laugh, recalling that disaster. The rice had somehow ended up stuck on the ceiling, and the fish had flown everywhere. It was a failed attempt, but also one of the first times she had felt truly happy after breaking up with Richard. "Yeah, I remember," she said, her eyes shining with a light she hadn't seen in a long time. Harry took her hand across the table, and she didn't pull it away. There was something in the way he looked at her, a warmth that made her feel safe and cherished. But just as she began to relax, an image of Richard flashed in her mind, with his easy smile and dark eyes filled with secrets. Guilt hit her hard. "Harry," she began, gently pulling her hand away. "I don't know if I still think about him." Harry nodded slowly, his face showing a mix of resignation and hope. "I know, Pamela, and I don't expect you to forget him overnight. But I want you to know that I'm here, that I love you, and that I'm willing to wait as long as you need." Pamela looked into his sincere eyes and felt a rush of mixed emotions. She wanted to reciprocate his feelings. She wanted to be able to give Harry everything he deserved. But every time she tried to move forward, something held her back. It was as if a part of her heart was still trapped in the past, tied to Richard. the silence between them filled with a tension they both could feel. Harry knew that she wasn't fully with him yet. That part of her still belonged to another. But he also knew he couldn't force her. He could only be patient and wait. Wait for her to be able to let go of Richard's ghost. "We could go to the beach this weekend," Harry suggested, trying to ease the tension. "It would do you good to get out of the city, breathe some fresh air." Pamela nodded, grateful for the change of subject. She knew Harry was right. She needed to get away, to clear her mind. But as she looked out the window at the bustling street, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever truly be able to leave Richard behind. As they left the cafe, Harry wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and Pamela allowed herself to rest her head against his chest. There were moments like this when she could almost convince herself that everything was okay, that she could move on without looking back. But at the same time, she knew that was a battle she would have to fight every day. Walking together down the cold streets, Harry kept her close, hoping that one day that contact would be enough to chase away the memories that tormented her. Over time, Harry and Pamela began a relationship that, although initially born from Pamela's need to feel loved and respected, began to evolve into something deeper. Harry fell madly in love with her, and although Pamela also developed feelings for him, the spectre of Richard always lingered in her mind. The attraction to Richard, mixed with memories of their time together, prevented Pamela from fully giving herself to Harry. After 6 months of dating, Pamela broke up with Fernando. The sound of ringing phones and the murmur of conversations filled the air in the law firm where Pamela worked. She was sitting at her desk, meticulously reviewing a file, her eyes moving quickly over the pages filled with legal text. She was good at her job. No, she was excellent. She knew how to dismantle a case with surgical precision, and that morning was no different. But despite her outward focus, there was a constant whirlwind of thoughts behind her serene eyes. Richard had reappeared in her life shortly after she graduated, as suddenly as he had disappeared. She received his call as she was leaving a meeting, his name flashing on her phone screen, provoking a visceral reaction within her. She wasn't ready to hear from him, but at the same time there was an insatiable curiosity, a desire to understand why he had betrayed her. Richard had pleaded for a chance to explain, to show her that he had changed. "I can't stop thinking about you, Pamela. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I know I messed it up. I want to make it right. I want to be the man you deserve," he had said, his voice sounding more mature, more determined than before. The first weeks after his return were difficult. Richard wasn't the same college guy. There was a seriousness in his eyes that Pamela had never seen before. Despite the doubts gnawing at her insides, she decided to give him a second chance, thinking that perhaps people really could change, and for 2 years they seemed to live a sort of renewed fairy tale. Richard tried hard, maybe too hard, to prove he was a new man. He organized romantic dinners, was always by her side in tough moments, and was her biggest support when she decided to embark on her career at the firm. Finally, when Richard proposed, Pamela accepted, feeling that maybe, just maybe, love could overcome anything. They married in a small ceremony surrounded by friends and family. Harry was there, of course. He couldn't not be there. He had been her closest friend, her confidant for so long that not inviting him would have been unthinkable. Yet, seeing him in the crowd, with that ever-protective gaze, Pamela couldn't help but feel a pang of something she couldn't quite identify. Was it remorse? Nostalgia? It was hard to say, and she decided not to delve too deeply into it. After the wedding, Pamela and Richard settled into a comfortable routine, both dedicating themselves to their respective careers. Pamela thrived at the firm, working alongside Harry, who had become her closest work partner. Together, they faced some of the most challenging cases that came their way, and when they won a major case that brought them recognition, Pamela felt she had finally found her place, not only in her professional life, but also in her personal life. Richard, for his part, had found his own path in a large engineering company and seemed to enjoy his work as much as Pamela enjoyed hers. However, there was something about him that didn't quite fit. He had always been a passionate man, and now that passion seemed to be directed solely towards his marriage with Pamela, as if he were trying to compensate for his past mistakes with an excess of devotion. Everything she asked for he did without questioning, without stopping to think if that was truly what they both wanted. One afternoon, after a long day at the firm, Harry and Pamela were in the conference room, celebrating their latest legal victory with a bottle of cheap wine that Harry had picked up from the corner store. "This is just the beginning, you know," Harry said, raising his glass. "We're going to win many more cases together." Pamela smiled, grateful for the lightness that Harry always brought to her life. But deep down, she knew there was more in his words than just camaraderie. There was a connection between them that had been forged in the darkest days of her life, and although she was now happy with Richard, she sometimes wondered if she had taken the right path. "Yes, of course," she replied, raising her glass as well. "But for now I think we deserve to enjoy this moment." Harry nodded, but he couldn't help but look at her with an intensity that always made Pamela feel seen, truly seen. Not like Richard, who, although he was an amazing husband, seemed more focused on redeeming his own guilt than on truly connecting with her. That night, Pamela returned home late. She found Richard in the kitchen, preparing dinner as he had been doing lately. There was something almost desperate in his effort to be perfect, to leave no cracks where the memories of his infidelity could seep through. "How was your day?" he asked with a warm smile, but his voice contained a note of anxiety he couldn't hide. "Good," she replied, leaving her bag on the table and walking over to kiss him on the cheek. "We won the case." Richard smiled, and his eyes sparkled with something Pamela hadn't seen in a long time: pride. "I knew you would. I always knew you were incredible." Pamela smiled beaten, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She sat at the table, watching Richard move around the kitchen with mechanical efficiency, placing the dishes, pouring the wine, serving the food. Everything seemed so perfect. Too perfect. As they had dinner, Richard continued talking about his day at work, his projects, and the new challenges he was facing. But Pamela could only think about the growing sense of emptiness within her, a feeling that intensified every time she thought of Harry, of how he understood her without words, of how his presence always made her feel safe and understood. "Pamela." Richard's voice brought her out of her reverie. He had been talking, but she hadn't heard anything he said. "I'm sorry, I was thinking about something else," she said, forcing a smile. Richard looked at her for a moment, his expression softening. "Pamela, if there's something bothering you, we can talk about it." She looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the desperation to make things right. But she also knew there was something he couldn't fix, something he couldn't even understand. She nodded slowly, looking away. "No, it's fine. I'm just tired." Richard nodded, but Pamela could see the shadow of doubt on his face. They finished dinner in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. That night, as they lay in bed, Richard wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Pamela closed her eyes, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that washed over her, the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was missing. A year after they got married, Pamela discovered she was pregnant with triplets. The news was met with joy, but also with a certain degree of concern from Richard, who didn't feel completely ready for the responsibility of raising 3 children at once. The couple decided that, to have help with the newborns, they would temporarily move in with Richard's parents. However, when the babies were born, all the joy turned into confusion and conflict. The 3 children, although healthy, had a darker skin tone than their parents. Pamela woke up in the early morning to the sound of one of the babies crying. The sharp and persistent sound filtered through the fog of her exhaustion, and her body reacted before her mind could process it. She got out of bed with slow, heavy movements, dragging her feet toward the crib where the triplets slept. The room was barely illuminated by a dim lamp in the corner, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. She picked up one of the babies, feeling the small weight against her chest, and began to rock him gently, trying to soothe his cries. Richard was still asleep, or at least pretending to be. In recent weeks, it had been Pamela who took care of the babies at night. Richard, once so attentive and willing, seemed to have distanced himself since the birth of the triplets. Pamela noticed it in the way he avoided looking her in the eye, in how he found excuses to leave the room when she was with the children. Everything had changed since that day in the hospital when the babies were born. She remembered the exact moment when everything began to crumble. She was lying in the hospital bed, exhausted but happy, looking at her 3 babies. Richard had entered the room smiling from ear to ear until he saw the children. His face changed, his smile faded, and a shadow of doubt crossed his eyes. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Pamela saw it. After a few seconds of silence, he asked quietly, trying to sound nonchalant, "Don't you think they look a bit different?" Pamela didn't understand at first. She looked at her babies, their tiny hands and feet moving gently, and then looked at Richard. "What do you mean?" Richard scratched his neck, uncomfortable. "I don't know, it's just they have a darker skin tone than I expected." Pamela felt as if cold water had been dumped over her. "Are you insinuating that they aren't yours?" Her voice came out louder than she intended, and she saw Richard tense up. "No, I'm not saying that. It's strange, isn't it?" Richard tried to soften the conversation, but the damage was already done. From that moment on, the tension between them grew, like a dark shadow enveloping their marriage. And when they returned home with the babies and moved in with Richard's parents, the situation only worsened. Richard's father, a strong-willed man with firm opinions, looked at the children with the same doubt, and that only served to add fuel to the fire. "Those kids don't look like they belong to the family," he had said one night, loud enough for Pamela to hear from the kitchen. Richard didn't correct him. He said nothing, and that was enough for Pamela to feel like her whole life was on the edge of a precipice. The relationship between Richard and his father had always been complicated, marked by unmet expectations and unspoken resentments, and now that resentment was directed toward her. One afternoon, while the babies were sleeping, Richard's father barged into the living room where Pamela was sitting, trying to enjoy a few moments of peace. His face was stern, his eyes dark and cold. "Pamela," he said, not even bothering to greet her, "we need to talk." Pamela looked up, already tired of the insinuations but ready to defend herself. "What's this about?" "We can't ignore the obvious. Those kids." He paused, as if searching for the right words. But Pamela knew there was no kindness in what he was about to say. "Richard and I have our doubts about their paternity." Pamela felt blood rush to her head. "Doubts about their paternity?" she repeated, indignation filling her voice. "Are you really suggesting that I've been unfaithful?" Richard's father didn't back down. "We're just saying there are questions that need answering. And considering your history with Harry has nothing to do with this," Pamela shouted, her hands trembling with anger. "I have never been unfaithful to Richard, never." Richard entered the room at that moment, his face pale and tense. "Dad, stop. This isn't necessary." But his father ignored him. "Richard has the right to know the truth, Pamela, and you, as his wife, have the duty to be honest." "I have always been honest," Pamela replied, tears filling her eyes with rage and frustration. "Richard, do you really think I would betray you like this? After everything we've been through, after what you did to me?" Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Richard's mother, who had been in the kitchen, quickly approached, her face filled with concern. "Please, let's stop this," she said softly, looking at her husband. "This is not good for anyone, especially not for the babies." Pamela took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the tears flowed freely down her cheeks. She looked at Richard, desperately searching for any sign of support, any indication that he still trusted her. But all she found was uncertainty. That night, while Pamela tried to feed one of the babies, the pressure finally overwhelmed her. Her whole body trembled, and the tears wouldn't stop flowing. She felt trapped in an impossible situation, attacked from all sides, even by the person who was supposed to be by her side. She felt the ground crumbling beneath her feet. Richard found her in the baby's room, sitting on the floor with one of the triplets in her arms, crying silently. He approached slowly, a mix of guilt and concern on his face. "Pamela," he started, his voice trembling. "I don't know what to say. I'm as confused as you are." "Confused?" Pamela lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. "This isn't confusion, Richard. It's an accusation. You're doubting me, my loyalty, and that..." Her voice broke. "That hurts more than anything you've done before." Richard knelt beside her, gently touching her shoulder. "Pamela, I don't know how to handle this. I need time to process everything." "Time?" Pamela laughed bitterly, a laugh filled with pain. "How much time do you need, Richard? How much time to decide if you trust your own wife?" Richard didn't respond. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Pamela didn't resist, but she didn't relax in his embrace either. They were together, but more separated than ever, and they both knew it. The following days were marked by uncomfortable silence and a tension that grew with every minute they spent in the same house. Richard's mother tried to keep the peace, bringing tea to Pamela, who was starting to show signs of postpartum depression. But Richard's father kept insisting on a paternity test, and every time he mentioned it, Richard fell deeper into silence. Pamela knew she was on the brink of a critical decision. She couldn't stay in a place where her honor was questioned and her word doubted. But at the same time, she couldn't bear the thought of taking her children away from their father. She looked at the triplets, sleeping in their cribs, and wondered what her life would be like if she made the decision to leave. Deep down, she questioned whether she could ever forgive Richard for doubting her in the first place. Pamela felt her heart pounding in her chest as she packed the last of the little blankets into the bag. The room was dark, illuminated only by the dim light of the night lamp that barely outlined the silhouettes of the furniture and the triplets' cribs. The babies were sleeping soundly, their tiny breaths unified in a calm rhythm that contrasted with the chaos swirling in Pamela's mind. That night, while Richard was out with friends at a bar and her in-laws were sleeping downstairs, Pamela made the decision she had been avoiding. She could no longer endure the constant humiliations, the silent whispers, and the judgmental looks. It wasn't just the questioning of her honor that hurt her, but the fact that Richard, the man she had chosen to share her life with, had done nothing to defend her. Each day, the house that had once been a refuge had turned into a prison. She carefully took the babies one by one, making sure not to wake them, and placed them in their car seats. As she did, her mind raced through every detail, every step she needed to take. She had been careful not to make noise, ensuring that each bag was filled with the essentials for at least a few days. She knew she couldn't stay long at her grandparents' town, but she needed a place where she could feel peace, even if just for a moment. When everything was ready, Pamela paused for a moment by the door, her hand on the doorknob. She looked around the room one last time, at the empty crib that Richard had lovingly built, the walls painted in a soft green, waiting for the beginning of a new life that now felt like a distant dream. She took a deep breath, feeling the mix of relief and fear swirling inside her. And then she opened the door and stepped out. The cold night air hit her as she walked out onto the patio, her steps silent on the gravel. The headlights of the car were the only lights in the darkness, and the engine purred softly as she turned it on. She glanced back at the house one last time, the dark, silent windows, and wondered if she would ever return. But now was not the time for doubt. With the babies safely in the back, Pamela put the car in gear and drove away, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The road to the town where her grandparents lived and where her parents had recently moved was long and lonely. The trees loomed like giant shadows on either side of the road, and the full moon barely illuminated the winding path. As she drove, Pamela's thoughts swirled like leaves in the wind. She remembered the time she had visited her grandparents as a child, summers filled with sunshine and laughter, far from the complications of adult life. Now that place was her only hope for finding refuge. When she finally arrived, the sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, tinting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. Pamela felt a strange calm wash over her as she saw her grandparents' old house, a small wooden home nestled among the trees, with its front garden full of flowers that her grandmother had always tended to with care. She stopped the car and took a deep breath, feeling the fresh country air fill her lungs. She got out of the car with the babies one by one, hugging them tightly to her chest. She walked to the front door of the house, feeling her legs tremble, not only from exhaustion, but also from nervousness. She didn't know how her family would react to seeing her like this, in the middle of the night, with 3 babies and no immediate explanation. But when she knocked on the door and it opened, all she felt was a wave of relief. Her mother appeared in the doorway, surprised at first, but then her face softened with a mix of love and concern. "Pamela, my girl, what happened?" Pamela could no longer contain herself. Tears began to flow from her eyes, and she threw herself into her mother's arms, clinging to her as if she were a lifeline in a stormy sea. "I needed to come here, Mum," she sobbed, feeling the weight of the past weeks slowly slip off her shoulders. "I couldn't stay there for another moment." Her mother held her tightly, stroking her hair as she had done when she was a child. "It's okay, you're safe now," she whispered. "Come on, come inside. Everything will be all right." Once inside, the warmth of the house enveloped her, and her father appeared in the living room, his face filled with surprise at seeing his daughter and the 3 little ones who were now softly crying. Without a word, he approached and took one of the babies in his arms, his expression shifting to one of tenderness and love. "We won't ask anything right now, Pamela," he said with a calmness that only a father can have. "But we want you to know that we're here for you, for the children. Always." Pamela sat on the sofa, feeling exhaustion wash over her like a wave. She began to recount what had happened, every detail, every doubt, and every accusation she had faced. Her mother listened in silence, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and understanding. When she finished, her mother sighed, taking her hand. "You should never have had to go through this alone," she said softly. "But now you're here, and we won't let anyone hurt you. Richard may think what he wants, but we know who you are, Pamela, and we know those babies are as much ours as they are yours." Pamela looked at her children, now asleep in their grandmother's and grandfather's arms, and felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Here, in this small house in the countryside, she felt protected, understood. Unlike Richard's family, her own family didn't need proof or explanations. They simply loved her and her children unconditionally. As the days passed, Pamela began to adjust to her new life. Her parents helped with the babies, and gradually, the pain and anger she had felt began to subside. But despite the calm she found in her surroundings, she couldn't shake the feeling of being lost. She knew this peace was temporary. Eventually, she would have to face Richard and make difficult decisions about her future and that of her children. But for now, here in the refuge of her family, she allowed herself a breather. As she watched the triplets sleep, their breaths calm and rhythmic, she knew she had done the right thing by escaping a situation that was tearing her apart. Here, at least, she could begin to find her way back to herself, one step at a time. The days had begun to take on a slow and painful rhythm in Pamela's grandparents' house. The calm she had found upon arrival now felt like a distant echo, suffocated by the dark cloud hovering over her family. Her father, who had always been a figure of strength, had changed and was deeply upset with Richard. There was something broken in his gaze, a mix of fury and vulnerability that Pamela had never seen before. That afternoon, her father had returned from the city, his eyes burning with a determination that Pamela couldn't ignore. He was resolved to confront Richard, to demand an apology for all the damage he had caused, for the unfounded doubt he had sown. "Dad, no one treats my daughter that way," he had said in a firm voice, his hands clenched into fists that trembled slightly from the contained emotion. "Dad, it's not necessary." Pamela had tried to dissuade him, feeling a wave of fear mixed with gratitude for his defense. "I don't want this to get out of control." But her father was determined. Despite Pamela's concern, he refused to listen. "I won't let this man tarnish your honor like this, not while I'm alive." And with those words, he had left the house, leaving Pamela with a sense of apprehension she couldn't shake off. When her mother received the call, Pamela felt as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. The news hit her like a physical blow. Her father had suffered a heart attack during the confrontation with Richard. Apparently, the argument had escalated more violently than anyone had anticipated, and amid the shouts and accusations, her father had collapsed, his hand clutching his chest, his face pale with pain. "Mom!" Pamela shouted, her hands shaking as she listened to her mother's broken words on the phone. "How is Dad?" "They took him to the hospital," her mother responded with a trembling voice. "We don't know more, but he's conscious." Pamela felt her world crumble once again. She left the babies in her mother's care and ran out, driving to the hospital at full speed, tears streaming down her cheeks, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and guilt. She couldn't stop thinking how all of this was her fault, how her father had decided to confront Richard for her, and now everything was in danger. When she arrived at the hospital, she found her mother waiting outside the emergency room, her face marked by anguish. Pamela ran toward her, and seeing the pain in her eyes, she felt something inside her break. "Mom," she murmured, barely able to hold back her tears. "He's stable, Pamela," her mother said, trying to sound calm, but Pamela could see the fear in her gaze. "The doctors say it was a minor heart attack, but they mentioned something about his ability to speak." The words hung heavy in the air, laden with uncertainty. Pamela felt a knot in her throat as she tried to process the information. They entered the room in silence, their footsteps echoing on the cold tile floor. When they saw her father in the bed, with tubes and machines surrounding him, Pamela had to fight against the wave of emotions that washed over her. "Dad," she whispered, approaching him with hesitant steps. Her father slowly opened his eyes, his expression tired but still filled with that unconditional love he had always had for his family. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse sound came out, and his eyes filled with frustration as he realized he couldn't express what he wanted to say. Pamela gently took his hand, her own tears falling freely now. "I'm so sorry, Dad. This is all my fault," she murmured, unable to control the pain she felt. But her father slowly shook his head, squeezing her hand with surprising strength. Although he couldn't speak, his eyes said everything she needed to know. It wasn't Pamela's fault. It had never been. He had done what a father should do, protect his daughter, and although things hadn't gone as he had hoped, he didn't blame her for anything. The following days in the hospital were a mix of hope and despair. Although her father survived the heart attack, the recovery was slow and complicated. The doctors explained that he had suffered minor damage that affected his ability to speak, and although they could work on his recovery, there were no guarantees he would ever be the same. Pamela spent every day by his side, helping him with exercises, trying to encourage him with her tired smile. But inside, she was crumbling. Guilt devoured her every time she saw him struggle to pronounce a word or when his frustration erupted into silent tears. She knew that the confrontation with Richard had been the trigger, and although she couldn't have foreseen what would happen, she felt it was all her responsibility. Richard had tried to visit them once in the hospital, but Pamela had rejected him with a cold and determined look. She didn't want to see him. She didn't want to hear his apologies or excuses. All she wanted was for him to leave and let her be in peace. Richard had left with a pained expression on his face, but Pamela had no room for compassion at that moment. Finally, after weeks in the hospital, the doctors discharged her father, although they warned that he would need ongoing care and therapy to recover at least some of his ability to speak. They returned to the grandparents and house, where her mother became his constant caregiver, while Pamela tried to hold the family together, taking care of her 3 babies and trying to cope with her own battle with the depression that threatened to consume her. It was during one of those long sleepless nights, sitting in the darkness of the living room, that she made a decision. She knew she couldn't continue like this, trapped in a life full of pain and resentment. She had to close that chapter of her life, for the sake of her own mental health and for her children's well-being. The next day, she contacted a lawyer and began the divorce process. Richard did not resist. He seemed to understand that the end of their story had come. The process was quick, almost without words between them, like 2 strangers who simply crossed paths in each other's lives. The day she received the final divorce papers, Pamela felt a mix of relief and sadness. She had freed herself from a burden, but she had also closed a chapter that, in some way, she had hoped would have a different ending. She knew that the road to recovery would be long, that her father would need time and effort to fully recover, and that she herself would have to learn to live with the scars of everything that had happened. But as she held her children in her arms and looked toward the uncertain future, she realized there was something beyond the pain, something she still had to discover. She had survived the storm, and now it was time to find her own way to the light, one day at a time. 8 years had passed since Pamela left the city and the turmoil of her old life behind. She had found refuge in the small rural town where her grandparents lived, a place of peace and new roots for her and her children. The triplets, now 8 years old, ran through the garden of the family home, their laughter echoing in the fresh country air. Peterson, Nicholas, and David had grown up together, like three parts of a whole, inseparable and always ready to face the world together. From a young age, the children had developed a special bond among themselves. It was not just the natural tie of siblings, but a connection forged through mutual understanding and constant support. At school, it was not uncommon for other children to make malicious comments about their family situation. Rumors and uncomfortable questions were frequent. But Peterson, Nicholas, and David were always prepared to defend themselves. "Hey, why are you and your mum different?" a boy once asked David in the schoolyard. Peterson, the oldest of the triplets, stepped forward, his face serious and challenging. "Because we are unique, and that makes us stronger." Nicholas, who had always been the most direct and passionate, joined him, his voice full of conviction. "And what's wrong with being different? If you have a problem with that, you'll have to talk to me." David, the most reserved and observant of the three, stayed in the background, his watchful eyes on his brothers. He knew he didn't need to say much. His presence was enough to reinforce the unity of their little group. Together, they protected each other from hurtful comments and supported one another at all times. Pamela watched them from a distance, her heart filled with pride and love. There was something about the way her children faced the world that gave her strength. Each day was a reminder that, despite the challenges, she had done the right thing by leaving everything behind to protect them and provide a safe, loving environment for them to grow up in. She had left her career as a lawyer to focus on raising her children and healing her own wounds. With the unwavering support of her parents, Pamela had spent these years centered on the kids and her emotional recovery. Although it had been difficult at first to let go of her career, she soon realized she had found a new sense of fulfillment in the role of a mother. Her grandparents' house had become a refuge, not only for Pamela but also for Peterson, Nicholas, and David. Every corner was filled with happy memories that helped counterbalance the darker days of her past. The children had learned to love life in the countryside, enjoying the freedom the environment offered. They ran among the trees, explored the nearby creek, and caught frogs on sunny days. One afternoon, while Pamela watched them play from the porch, Nicholas approached with a thoughtful look on his face. "Mum, do you think we will ever get to know the city?" he asked with curiosity. Peterson, who was always attentive to his siblings' conversations, came closer too, his serious eyes fixed on his mother. "Yeah, Mum, will we ever go back?" Pamela sighed softly, looking at her three children with a mix of love and sadness. She knew the moment would come when they would have to talk about their past, about their father, and about the life she had left behind. But she also knew that moment was not now. The children deserved to enjoy their childhood without the complications of a story that still hurt. "I don't know, kids," she finally replied, with a gentle smile. "But here we have everything we need, right?" The three children nodded, although their gazes still reflected the curiosity and innocence of childhood. They were content with their mother's answer, at least for the moment, and returned to playing, their laughter filling the air once again. As the sun began to set, painting the sky a warm orange, Pamela allowed herself a moment of reflection. She knew there was still a long way to go, both for her and her children, but she also knew that together as a family, they could face anything. Peterson, Nicholas, and David continued to be a constant reminder of the strength and love they had built together over the years, each with their unique personality, each with their special role in the small family unit they had formed. As she watched them run toward the creek, laughing and joking, Pamela felt that despite all they had lost, they had gained something much more valuable, a family united by understanding, respect, and a love that transcended any obstacle. The sun was high in the sky, bathing her grandparents' small garden in a golden light. Peterson, Nicholas, and David played in the yard, their laughter and shouts filling the air with carefree joy. Pamela, sitting on the porch with a book in her hands, smiled every time she looked up to watch them. It had been difficult years, but days like these reminded her why she had made the decision to move here. away from the chaos of the city. Suddenly, the sound of a car approaching broke the tranquility of the afternoon. Pamela looked up, her brow furrowed in surprise. She wasn't expecting visitors. The car stopped in front of the house, and when the door opened, her heart skipped a beat. She recognized immediately the figure stepping out of the vehicle. It was her ex-mother-in-law. The woman moved slowly, using a cane for support, her face marked by the wrinkles of time and illness. She looked much older than Pamela remembered, more fragile, as if every step took tremendous effort. Instinctively, Pamela stood up and walked toward her, feeling a mix of confusion and apprehension. "What are you doing here?" Pamela asked in a low voice, trying to keep calm while the children stopped to observe the newcomer. The ex-mother-in-law looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and regret, finding Pamela's gaze. "I need to talk to you, Pamela. It's important. Please." There was something in her tone, in the way her voice trembled, that made Pamela hesitate. She glanced at her children, who were still watching with curiosity, and then nodded slowly. "Let's go inside." She helped the woman up the porch steps and led her into the living room. Once inside, Pamela made sure the woman was comfortable in an armchair before sitting down across from her, her hands nervously intertwined in her lap. "What is this about?" she asked, trying to maintain emotional distance, although a part of her felt a pang of concern seeing the woman in such a state. The ex-mother-in-law sighed deeply, and for a moment she seemed to gather the strength to speak. "Pamela, I came because I don't have much time left," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sick, very sick. The doctors say there's nothing they can do." Pamela felt a wave of compassion mixed with surprise. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded, waiting for the woman to continue. "I can't take this secret to the grave," the ex-mother-in-law continued, her eyes filled with tears. "I've kept a secret for many years, a secret that has affected more people than I can count." Pamela furrowed her brow, intrigued. "A secret? What do you mean?" The woman looked down at the floor as if searching for the right words. "During the early years of my marriage to Richard's father," she paused, breathing heavily, "I had an affair with another man. His name was Thomas. He was a black man." Pamela felt her heart stop for a moment. She didn't know where this was going, but the woman's tone suggested something that would change everything she thought she knew. "Thomas and I fell in love. It was something that should never have happened, but it did." Tears began to fall down her cheeks. "Richard is the product of that relationship. I never told anyone. Not my husband, not Richard. No one." The air seemed to run out of the room. Pamela stood speechless, unable to process what she had just heard. Richard was not her husband's son. Richard was the child of a man with whom her ex-mother-in-law had had an affair. "Why are you telling me this now?" Pamela finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. The ex-mother-in-law raised her gaze, her eyes filled with palpable pain. "Because I don't want to take this secret to the grave. Because I needed someone to know, someone who could understand." Pamela remained silent, trying to sort through her thoughts. Everything began to fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for years. The comments about the triplets' skin tone, Richard's doubts and accusations, everything seemed to make more sense now. "Richard never knew," the woman continued, "and neither did his father. I kept it hidden because I was scared. Scared of what could happen if the truth came to light. And when I saw your children, I knew I had to say something, but I lacked the courage." Pamela took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. The woman's confession explained many things, but it also brought with it a torrent of difficult emotions to handle. "I don't know what to say," Pamela admitted, looking at her with a mixture of compassion and confusion. "I don't expect you to forgive me or to understand," the ex-mother-in-law said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted you to know the truth before it's too late." Pamela nodded slowly. The truth, however shocking, didn't change what had happened between her and Richard, but now she understood where part of the pain and confusion that had affected their marriage and her life was coming from. "Thank you for telling me," Pamela finally said, her voice soft but firm. "I hope you find the peace you seek." The ex-mother-in-law smiled weakly, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Pamela. I just want Richard, for my grandchildren, for all of you to have a better life than I had." Pamela accompanied her to the door, watching as she slowly walked to her car. She knew that this unexpected visit would leave a mark on her, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. The truth, no matter how difficult, always had a way of freeing the burdens of the past. As she watched the car drive away, Pamela felt something change within her. Perhaps now, with the truth finally revealed, she could find a way to completely close that painful chapter of her life and move forward, knowing she had done everything possible to protect her family and herself from the shadows of the past. The wind gently blew through the trees, causing the leaves to fall like a soft rain onto the ground. Pamela stood by the living room window, watching her children play in the yard. Peterson, Nicholas, and David were running around an old oak tree, laughing and shouting as they chased each other. Seeing them like this, so full of life and joy, gave her a sense of peace that had taken years to find. 2 months had passed since her ex-mother-in-law's unexpected visit. The woman's confession had been an unexpected blow, but over time, Pamela had come to accept the truth. Richard was not the son of his supposed father, but the product of an extramarital affair with a man she had never known. The news had brought an odd sense of closure, an explanation for so many unanswered questions that had lingered for years. When Richard appeared at her front door, Pamela knew immediately that something had changed. He looked thinner, with deep bags under his eyes and an expression of despair in his gaze. He carried with him the weight of his mother's revelation, a burden that seemed to crush him with each step he took toward her. "Pamela," he said in a hoarse voice, barely a whisper. Pamela looked at him, her expression serene but firm. She had worked hard to reach this point, to find peace within herself and to protect her children from more pain. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but she also knew she was ready to face it. "Richard," she replied in a calm voice, giving him a slight nod to come in. Richard stepped into the house, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for something to give him strength. His mother had passed away a few days ago, and on her deathbed, she revealed the truth about his real father. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," he started, his voice trembling slightly. "But I needed to see you. I needed to apologize, Pamela. Not just for what happened between us, but for how I treated you, for what happened to your father, for not believing you, for all the accusations." Pamela watched him in silence, feeling a mix of emotions. There was a part of her that wanted to feel compassion, that understood the confusion Richard must be feeling now that he knew the truth about his origins. But there was also a part that couldn't forget the pain he had caused her, the doubts, the humiliations. "Richard, I know this is hard for you," Pamela finally said, "and I don't want to minimize what you're feeling right now, but you also have to understand that all this, everything that has happened, cannot be undone with an apology." Richard nodded, his eyes filled with sadness. "I know, but I want to try to fix things. I want to be part of my children's lives. I want the chance to show them that I can be a good father." Pamela took a deep breath, looking at Richard with a clarity that only years of struggle and recovery could have given her. "You can see the kids, Richard. They have the right to know their father. But as for us," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "that door is closed for me. I have spent too much time rebuilding my life, finding my strength, and I cannot go back." Richard lowered his head, absorbing her words. Pamela could see the pain on his face, the internal struggle raging within him, but she also knew that this was the right thing to do. She could not allow Richard's confusion and pain to disrupt the new balance she had found. "I understand," Richard finally said, his voice subdued. "I just want to do things right, for once in my life." Pamela nodded. "You can start by being a good father to your children. That's all I ask of you." Richard fell silent for a moment, then looked at Pamela with a determination she hadn't seen in him for a long time. "I will. I promise." Pamela watched as he walked out to the garden. The kids stopped at the sight of Richard, their laughter and play ceasing when they recognized him. They looked at each other, then at their mother, seeking her approval. Pamela gave a small nod, and with a bit of hesitation, they approached their father. Richard knelt down, extending his arms to them. "Hello, kids." His voice was filled with emotion. "I'm your dad." Peterson, always the most serious, was the first to step forward. He looked at Richard with curious eyes and a small spark of hope. Nicholas and David followed, each reflecting their own mix of emotions on their faces. As she watched them interact with their father, Pamela felt a mix of relief and sadness. She knew this was a necessary step for her children. They needed to know their father and decide for themselves how they felt about it. But she also knew that her own path had taken her beyond what she once shared with Richard. As the afternoon began to fade, Richard said goodbye to the kids, promising to return soon. Pamela accompanied him to the door, and as she watched him walk away, she knew that despite everything, she had made the right decision. Richard would have the opportunity to be part of his children's lives, but she would not allow herself to go back. Pamela's days had filled with a new energy since she decided to resume her career. She had spent years dedicated solely to her children and her own emotional healing, but now she felt it was time to refocus on herself, to find a balance between her personal and professional life. So, with determination, she opened her own law firm in the small town where she had found refuge. Specializing in family law had not been a difficult decision. Her own experiences had given her a unique perspective and a genuine empathy for those going through family and personal conflicts. Pamela wanted to help others navigate the challenges she herself had faced, providing support and understanding amid the storm. And soon, her reputation grew. She was known not only for her legal competence, but also for her ability to connect with her clients on a deeper level. One morning, while walking through the courthouse halls after a particularly challenging hearing, Pamela suddenly stopped when she saw a familiar figure. Harry was there, standing by a window, with a folder in his hand and his hair slightly disheveled, just as she remembered. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Her heart involuntarily skipped a beat, and a series of memories flooded her mind. Harry saw her, and a smile spread across his face. "Pamela," he said, with a warmth in his voice that made her feel as if they had never been apart. "What a surprise to see you here." Pamela smiled back, feeling a mix of surprise and familiarity. "Harry, it's been so long." They approached each other, and for a moment, they simply looked at one another as if assessing the time that had passed and all that had happened since the last time they met. Harry hadn't changed much. He was still the same kind and thoughtful man she had always known, although his eyes seemed to carry a new depth, a wisdom gained through experience. "I never married, you know," Harry said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I guess I never found someone who made me feel like you did." Pamela felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't expected to hear that. She knew Harry had been an important part of her life at one time, someone who had always been there when she needed him most. But she also knew she had left that chapter behind, that she had made difficult decisions and moved on for the sake of her children and herself. "Harry," she began, but he gently interrupted her. "I'm not asking for anything," he said with a smile. "I just wanted you to know that I still think of you, that you've always been important to me. And if you ever need someone to talk to, or just to have a coffee, I'm here." Pamela nodded slowly, feeling a warmth in his words. There was something comforting in knowing that, despite all the time and distance, Harry still cared about her. "Thank you, Harry," she finally replied. "I would love to have that coffee." Harry smiled more broadly, as if he had been waiting to hear those words. "How about now?" he asked, with a hint of hope in his voice. Pamela hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. There was something in his proposal that felt right, like a natural extension of the path she had begun to walk. "Sure, now is fine." They left the courthouse together and walked along the cobblestone streets of the town until they reached a small cafe they both remembered from their university days. They sat by a window, and for a while, they simply enjoyed each other's company, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. "I'm glad to see you doing so well, Pamela," Harry finally said, breaking the silence. "I always knew you had incredible inner strength, but seeing you here doing so much for others, it's inspiring." Pamela smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, Harry. It hasn't been easy, but I'm finding my way." Harry nodded, and for a moment they both sat in silence, savoring each other's company. There was a peace in his presence, a sense of having reached a mutual understanding without the need for words. "And you?" Pamela asked, leaning slightly forward. What have you been doing all these years? Harry shrugged slightly. Working, mainly. I've also been involved in some pro bono projects, helping people who can't afford a lawyer. I suppose in a way, I've always tried to follow your example. Pamela chuckled softly, a sound that Harry had missed more than he realized. Well, it seems we both found our way somehow. Harry nodded, and a more serious expression crossed his face. Pamela, and I know it's probably too soon for this, but I want you to know that there's no pressure from me. I just want you to know that I'm here, I'll always be here, and I'd love to explore whatever this could be. Pamela looked into his eyes and saw the sincerity there, the same sincerity she had always appreciated in him. She wasn't sure what she felt exactly or what the future might hold, but she knew she was open to discovering it. Thank you, Harry, she said softly. Let's take it step by step, okay? Harry smiled and nodded, step by step. As they finished their coffee, Pamela felt a slight sense of hope. She had spent so much time building walls around herself, protecting herself and her children from further pain, that she had forgotten what it was like to open up to new possibilities. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let a little light in again. Pamela stood in front of her mirror, adjusting a soft blue blouse she had chosen carefully for that afternoon. There was something different about her reflection, something she hadn't seen in a long time. A spark in her eyes, a slight smile that appeared effortlessly. She took a moment to breathe deeply, feeling the mix of nervousness and excitement that overwhelmed her. Since that unexpected meeting at the courthouse, her life had begun to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. Harry had started to become a part of her daily routine in a natural and pressure-free way. At first, they met for coffee a couple of times a week, but soon those meetings became more frequent. Conversations that began with casual topics about work and daily life deepened into discussions about their hopes, fears, and what they had both learned on their separate paths. Harry had changed over the years. His love for Pamela, which once was impulsive and filled with youth, now had a depth and maturity that she had never seen before. There was no urgency in his courtship, no pressure for her to commit to anything. Instead, there was an infinite patience, a willingness to wait and let her set the pace. One afternoon, while they were walking through the nearby park by Pamela's house, Harry suddenly stopped and took her hand. Pamela, I know it won't be easy. I know you've been through a lot, and I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I want you to know that I'm here, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes. Pamela looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of insecurity or doubt, but found none. There was a serenity in him, a security that made her feel calmer. Thank you, Harry, she replied softly. I can't promise you anything more than my honesty. And so they did. Harry began to visit her house more frequently, and her children soon got used to seeing him. At first, Peterson, Nicholas, and David looked at him with curiosity, as if trying to decipher who this man was who came to see their mother. But Harry, with his natural patience and genuine interest in them, soon broke the ice. Uncle Harry, look what I made, Nicholas exclaimed one day, running up to him with a drawing of a dragon he had created at school. Harry crouched down to be at Nicholas's level, taking the drawing with exaggerated amazement. Wow, that's incredible. This dragon looks really fierce. Nicholas beamed with pride, and Peterson and David, seeing their brother's positive reaction, began to approach Harry as well. Harry seemed to have a natural gift for interacting with them. He played ball in the yard, helped them with their homework, and told them stories about his own childhood. Pamela watched all of this from a distance, impressed by how quickly he had adapted to her family. One day, while Harry was helping David build a castle with toy blocks, Pamela approached him and whispered in his ear, "It seems you've won the boys over." Harry smiled, his eyes shining with a warmth Pamela hadn't seen in a long time. "They're good boys, Pamela, very good boys, and that's all thanks to you." Pamela felt a wave of emotion wash over her at those words. She had worked so hard to raise her children in an environment of love and respect, and seeing Harry acknowledge that meant more than he could imagine. The kids soon began to call him Uncle Harry, a title Harry accepted with a smile and a heart full of gratitude. Every time he heard it, Pamela felt her family was coming together in a way she had never anticipated. It wasn't that Harry filled a void. Rather, he added something new and wonderful to what already existed. One afternoon, after a day full of games and laughter, Harry stayed late. The kids were already in bed, and the house was quiet for the first time all day. Sitting together on the couch, Harry looked at Pamela, his face suddenly serious. "Pamela, I want you to know something," he said softly. "I've learned a lot about myself in these past few years, and I know that what I feel for you isn't just an old flame rekindled. It's something deeper, something that has grown and matured over time. I want to be part of your life, of their lives, in any way you allow me." Pamela looked at him, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that Harry was serious, that his words came from the deepest part of his being, and although part of her still felt the fear of opening up to love again, another part was drawn to the possibility of a new beginning, of a new chapter filled with love and understanding. "Harry," she began, taking his hand, "I don't know where this will lead us, but I want to discover it with you." Harry smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "That's all I need, Pamela. Step by step together." And so a new phase began to unfold in Pamela's life. With each passing day, she felt her heart open a little more, allowing Harry and their renewed love to find their place in her life and that of her children. She didn't know what the future held for them, but for the first time in a long time, she felt excited to discover it. "I had found the strength to love again, and with Harry and his children by my side, I knew I could face anything that came my way." Dear friends, we hope you enjoyed this story as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do so. Your subscription means the world to us and helps us keep sharing amazing and heartfelt stories with you. Your feedback is incredibly important to us. Did you like the story? Please leave a comment and let us know what you think. It helps us continue creating stories that resonate and inspire. Right now, a playlist of more stories from our channel is appearing on your screen. We invite you to explore and enjoy these other captivating tales. Thank you for being part of our journey. We look forward to sharing more stories with you soon. Until next time.